Guys, tonight we wander into the odd corners of history, where laws weren't just rules, they were weird, whimsical, and sometimes downright ridiculous. You probably won't survive this journey if you take every law seriously. But that's the fun, isn't it? Imagine stepping into a world where citizens had to follow instructions that seem completely absurd to your modern brain. And yet these rules once shaped entire cities, kingdoms, and empires. They were the threads in the social fabric, sewn tightly with the quirks of humanity. You wander down cobbled streets of forgotten towns, the air thick with smoke from hearth fires, and every corner whispers, "Did they really make people do this?" As though you're reading a bedtime story narrated by the past itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, comment your location and local time. I'm always curious to see who's listening to these late-night historical oddities from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you drift through this first tale, picture yourself in a bustling medieval town, boots echoing on cobblestone. The mayor is frowning, scribbling in a thick ledger, and the town crier bellows out proclamations that make you tilt your head in disbelief. For instance, did you know that in 14th century England, it was illegal to wear certain colors unless you were royalty or nobility? Yes, you wander past a peasant in vibrant weed, and he's risking hefty fines or worse. Scholars still argue whether these clothing laws were primarily about maintaining social hierarchy or simply about controlling textile trades. But either way, the absurdity is undeniable. You can almost feel the itchy wool of forbidden tunic brushing against your skin, a reminder that rules once intruded even into fashion. Then there's the curious case of sumptuary laws, which sound dull, but their consequences are anything but. These regulations dictated what ordinary citizens could eat, drink, and were sometimes down to the type of shoes or hats permissible. You probably wouldn't survive these dietary restrictions if you tried following them strictly today. For instance, eating too much meat on certain holy days could land a citizen in trouble, and yet nobles could gorge themselves freely. You wander through a royal banquet hall in your mind, imagining a duke smirking while peasants quietly nibble on stale bread outside. Oddly enough, these laws often had loopholes, and inventive townsfolk would find ways to sneak extra pies or slightly off-shaped garments, skirting the legal eye. It's a delicate dance of rebellion and compliance that feels almost sleepy, like a whispered secret in the night. You might be tempted to think that such laws were always harsh, but some carried an odd, almost humorous intention. In ancient Rome, for example, one law restricted the number of guests allowed at private dinner parties. You wander into a villa with marble floors, and the host nervously counts heads, trying to avoid attracting the magistrate's ire. Scholars still argue whether this law aimed to curb political plotting over lavish feasts simply to control ostentatious displays of wealth. But either interpretation makes you grin at the absurdity. Imagine hosting your friends today and suddenly being fined for inviting an extra person to dinner. Ridiculous, yet historically accurate. And then there's the sleepy charm of enforcement methods. In some medieval towns, officials would patrol markets not only to catch thieves, but also to ensure citizens wore appropriate clothing or consumed permitted foods. You wander past a sleepy town square where merchants yawn, tending stalls with carefully measured produce, while the lawman scribbles in his notebook, eyes half closed yet vigilant. Oddly enough, people often complied with these laws not out of fear but from habit or social pressure. The absurdity lingers in the air, mingling with the smells of baking bread and burning torches. It's a world where tiny regulations dictated the rhythm of daily life, and imagining yourself living under them feels both surreal and strangely comforting, like a historical as Mr. Your journey continues through narrow alleys and open courtyards, where signs proclaim prohibitions on seemingly trivial matters. No running in the town square. Do not whistle at night. Only merchants may sell onions on Tuesdays. These are the whispers of history that make you tilt your head and smile. Scholars still argue whether these rules genuinely prevented chaos or were simply exercises in control. But either way, they add texture to the sleepy narrative. You can almost hear the muffled giggles of children testing boundaries, running a little too fast, only to be gently scolded by a watchful patrolling elder. The mundane yet bizarre fabric of the past traps around you, lulling you further into a dreamy historical trance. Then there are the laws that punished people for talking back to authority, but with strange limitations. You wander into a courtroom where a citizen is scolded for murmuring dissent, though technically the law only forbade insults to officials, not casual muttering. The fine line between legality and absurdity is razor thin, and it makes you chuckle softly to yourself. Even today, imagining such precise yet arbitrary rules gives a cozy shiver, the kind that nudges your mind toward that half-awake, half-dreaming state. It's a space where curiosity meets sleepiness, where each law is a tiny door into a world that no longer exists but lives vividly in your imagination. Even in the quiet moments, the laws weren't silent. You wander past town halls, imagining scribes carefully recording every violation, from unauthorized hats to overly enthusiastic feasting. There's an almost sleepy rhythm to this bureaucracy, a cadence that's oddly soothing. It reminds you that humans have always been obsessed with order, even if the order sometimes borders on hilarity. Oddly enough, the townsfolk coughed and laughed behind closed doors, trading stories of narrow escapes from fines or clever loopholes that allowed them to bend the rules ever so slightly. It's a reminder that while laws attempt to control life, human creativity always finds a sleepy, mischievous way around them. As your mind drifts deeper, picture yourself wandering under a crescent moon, passing quiet cottages where citizens rest after a day of obeying or cleverly avoiding these odd mandates. Scholars still argue whether such strictures truly maintain social harmony or mostly performative, but either conclusion paints a vivid picture. You notice the subtle humor hidden in history's paperwork, the irony of rules so specific that breaking them becomes almost an art form. It's a world that existed, quietly absurd, and now lives in imagination. And finally, as the first section closes, you can feel the gentle pull toward curiosity mingled with drowsiness. The laws themselves, strange as they were, carry a whisper of human nature, our desire to control, to conform, to rebel, and to find humor even under the weight of authority. You wander back through the town square in your mind one last time, hearing the echo of a long-forgotten yet eternally amusing, a precursor to the bizarre regulations we'll explore in the coming sections. This is your gateway into the weird, sleepy, and captivating world of historical oddities, perfectly imperfect and utterly relaxing. You wander through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, where marble columns stretch into the sky and the aroma of roasted meats mingles with the dust of cobblestones. The sun sets lazily behind the hills, casting long shadows that crawl across the forum, and somewhere a lone flute plays a sleepy tune. Tonight, your focus drifts to something deceptively mundane yet entirely fascinating: the regulations on drinking. Yes, in Rome, the act of lifting a cup to your lips was not merely personal, it was political, social, and occasionally absurdly controlled. You probably won't survive if you try to follow all these laws literally today. But let's tiptoe through the rules, glass in hand, as if you're attending a midnight symposium. Picture yourself stepping into a bustling tavern, the clinking of cups echoing against stone walls. You notice the patrons' gestures are almost choreographed. Certain types of wine were reserved for particular classes, and the law dictated exactly how much you could consume during public celebrations. Scholars still argue whether these restrictions were about health, morality, or simply maintaining social hierarchy. But either way, it paints a surreal image an empire obsessed with controlling the very act of drinking. You wander past a senator whispering to a merchant, both aware that the wrong glass at the wrong time could invite a scolding or worse, a fine. The rules are precise: certain wines are for banquets only, while others are forbidden for slaves. Even the color of the wine mattered on particular festival days. Then there's the quirky side in some Roman cities. Citizens were technically allowed to drink only during daylight hours. Imagine wandering through an evening feast, secretly passing wine under the table because the law frowns upon nocturnal indulgence. It's a detail that feels almost comical now. Yet for the Romans it was serious business. You can almost feel the thrill of bending the rules, the tiny pulse of adrenaline in a world otherwise so strictly ordered. Oddly enough, some tavern owners found clever loopholes, offering morning wine that could be sipped at twilight, a technicality that made both patrons and magistrates smile or groan depending on their mood. You might be tempted to think all drinking laws were purely prohibitive, but they also carried an educational undertone. Drinking in moderation was extolled as a civic virtue. A law might not simply forbid excess, it instructed subtly on how to behave in society. You wander through a mental banquet, imagining a young Roman learning the ropes: sip slowly, toast appropriately, and never, ever appear drunk in public. Violations could result in fines, public embarrassment, or even temporary banishment from certain civic events. Scholars still argue whether this was truly about public decor or just a way for the elite to display superiority. But the sleepy rhythm of these rules is oddly comforting, like a lullaby delivered by the past. And there's the bizarre twist: some regions forbade specific additives in wine. You wander past a stall where a merchant carefully measures herbs and spices into small vials, knowing full well that a wrong mix could land him in legal trouble. The law was surprisingly precise: no excessive honey here, no forbidden resin there. It's a minor detail, yet it illustrates Rome's meticulous control over daily life. You might chuckle softly, imagining a modern bartender in Rome, nervously checking labels under flickering torchlight, all to comply with rules centuries old. And yet these laws weren't enforced strictly every day. Enforcement varied wildly, depending on the city, the magistrate, and the mood of the populace. You wander down a quiet alley, imagining a sleepy official glancing at tavern windows, noting excesses only when convenient. Sometimes these laws acted more as a social guideline than a rigid restriction, a reminder of order rather than a weapon of punishment. It's an interesting balance: control tempered by pragmatism, which gives you a sleepy sense of connection with the past. The oddest part might be the ceremonial drinking rules. Certain festivals demanded that wine be consumed in exact rituals: cups had to be passed a specific number of times, toasts uttered in precise order, and failure to comply could invite disapproval or even a legal reprimand. You wander through a festival in your mind, hearing murmurs of scholars debating: should the libations be poured clockwise or counterclockwise? Scholars still argue whether these rituals were deeply religious or simply about preserving civic decorum. But either way, the minute attention to detail is hypnotically fascinating. As you drift further, picture a Roman scholar or patrician quietly noting these rules in the leather-bound codex, the sound of pen scratching on parchment blending with distant flutes and the low murmur of the city. Oddly enough, drinking laws intersected with other regulations: only certain types of music were allowed during toasts, and even seating arrangements could dictate who was permitted to sip first. The sheer specificity borders on comical, yet it's entirely real. You wander past these details as if floating through a dreamscape of legal and social minutiae, lulled by the rhythm of a civilization obsessed with order, yet delighting in its peculiarities. And finally, you consider the personal consequences for ignoring these rules. Fines, public embarrassment, or subtle social exclusion could result from a poorly timed drink. Imagine a young Roman at his first banquet, nervously calculating sips while trying to appear relaxed and charming, a scenario both relatable and oddly sleep-inducing for a modern listener. Scholars still argue whether these measures effectively controlled behavior or were largely performative, yet the blend of humor, absurdity, and meticulous control is undeniable. The laws weren't just about drinking, they were about navigating the subtle currents of social life, about knowing where you stood in a hierarchy and performing accordingly. As Section 2 closes, you feel a gentle pull toward curiosity mixed with drowsiness. The world of Rome and drinking laws, strange yet strangely structured, offers a perfect bridge between history and dream. You wander past marble columns and quiet taverns one last time in your imagination, hearing faint echoes of toasts long past, and feeling the sleepy rhythm of an empire that controlled the act of sipping wine with astonishing precision. You wander across the narrow, winding streets of a medieval European village, the evening mist curling around thatched rooftops, and the scent of damp earth mingles with the smoke of hearth fires. Tonight your gaze drifts to the curious, sometimes baffling laws governing what people could and couldn't do for fun. In this sleepy world, hobbies weren't merely personal, they were sometimes outlawed, strictly monitored, or regulated to protect moral standards or social hierarchies. You probably won't survive if you try to follow every medieval pastime, while literally. But wandering through these sleepy oddities is oddly comforting, like a whispered secret from centuries past. Imagine a young apprentice in the town square, clutching a set of dice. Gambling with dice, once a common pastime, was oft unforbidden by local laws. Scholars still argue whether these bans were primarily moralistic, aimed at reducing vice, or economic, intended to curb losses that might affect trade or family stability. Regardless, you can almost feel the tension as he rolls, eyes darting to the patrolling watchman. The dice clatter softly on cobblestones, and you notice that even minor infractions, like playing an extra game of dice, could result in fines or public shaming. The combination of strict enforcement and human ingenuity makes the scene feel dreamlike, as if time itself bends to accommodate both rules and rebellion. Then there are the laws surrounding hunting and falconry, hobbies normally associated with leisure or status. Commoners weren't allowed to hunt certain animals without permits, and in some regions, falconry, the art of training birds of prey, were strictly reserved for nobility. You wander through a dense forest in your mind, where a young hunter hides behind a tree, glancing nervously at a distant noble. Scholars still argue whether these laws were meant to protect wildlife, consolidate power, or simply entertain the aristocracy. But either way, the mental image is oddly soothing in its absurdity. The thrill of bending the rules, coupled with the quiet natural surroundings, evokes a sleepy, contemplative state, perfect for late-night exploration. Art and music were not immune to regulation either. Certain instruments or types of songs were forbid, and during specific times or in certain locales. Imagine wandering past a village here where a minstrel delicately plucks a lute, careful not to play a banned melody. The law dictated rhythm, style, and even subject matter, though enforcement varied. You can almost hear the gentle murmurs of townsfolk, some amused, others annoyed, as they navigate these constraints. Scholars still argue whether these laws aimed at preserving moral order, religious piety, or cultural hierarchy. But the result is a sleepy, whimsical tapestry of rules affecting seemingly trivial daily joys. One of the quirkiest key aspects was the prohibition of specific sports or games. Archery contests, wrestling matches, or even foot races could be restricted to protect nobility, maintain peace, or simply preserve resources. You wander past a village green, where local youths crouch behind hedges, imagining a playful sprint forbidden by law. The air is thick with tension and anticipation. Yet the absurdity of banning something so natural sparks a wry smile. Oddly enough, enforcement was sometimes lenient. The village elder might pretend not to notice, blending enforcement with subtle amusement. The contrast between strict law and human creativity, a hallmark of medieval life, makes your mind drift into a dreamy, relaxed state. Odd pastimes also included theatrical performances. Traveling troops were occasionally restricted, required to obtain permits or limited to specific days. You wander through a moonlit market square in your imagination, imagining jesters performing quietly, mindful of laws that might otherwise silence their acts. Scholars still argue whether these restrictions were rooted in political control, moral concerns, or taxation, but either way, the image of clandestine performance in a sleepy medieval town evokes both curiosity and a soothing, dreamlike rhythm. Even reading and education had peculiar constraints. Some local laws prohibited reading certain texts, often religious or political, outside of authorized contexts. Picture yourself in a dimly lit scriptorium, candle flickering as a young scholar hesitates to open a forbidden manuscript. The quiet tension and careful attention to detail are oddly hypnotic. Scholars still debate whether such rules truly stifled knowledge or inadvertently created curiosity and subversive learning. But either interpretation contributes to a rich, sleepy narrative. Another curious regulation involved clothing for leisure. Certain fabrics or adornments were restricted even during festivals, limiting how people could express themselves during moments of joy. You wander past villagers enjoying a small fair, noting the subtle color restrictions that mark social boundaries. Scholars still argue whether these rules were strictly enforceable or mostly symbolic. But either way, the mental image feels like a soft, historical as mister, where the color of a tunic carries weight and meaning beyond its visual appeal. Oddly enough, some laws were so precise they affected how hobbies were physically performed. Archers might be restricted to certain distances, dancers to specific formations, and musicians to exact tempos during celebrations. You wander through a festival in your mind, noticing each movement choreographed, yet infused with human whimsy and improvisation. Scholars still debate whether these measures were about safety, morality, or status, but the interplay between rigidity and creativity evokes a gentle, sleepy fascination. And finally, you consider the cumulative effect of all these forbidden hobbies. Citizens navigated life carefully, balancing enjoyment with legality. It's a curious rhythm, both oppressive and comforting. You wander back through the village square one last time, hearing echoes of dice rolling, flutes playing, and young hunters hiding in forests, all under the watchful eye of a sleepy, whimsical legal system. The absurdity of it all, combined with the soft imagery of nightly village life, lulls your imagination into a calm, historical reverie, setting the stage for the next sections of our journey into the world of strange and wonderful laws. You wander through a sleepy medieval town, morning mist clinging to the cobblestones as merchants arrange their wares. But tonight, your mind drifts to something that is both mundane and absurd: taxes that made zero sense. Imagine paying for things you never thought could be taxable, being fined for activities that seemed trivial, or being charged simply because you existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. You probably won't survive if you tried following all of these taxes literally today. But it's a whimsical journey into the peculiar fiscal imagination of past societies. Consider, for instance, the infamous urine acts in ancient Rome. You wander past latrines, inhaling the sharp scent of ammonia, and notice citizens exchanging coins to relieve themselves. Yes, the Roman Emperor Vespasian taxed the collection of urine, which was used for tanning leather and laundering. Scholars still argue whether this tax was meant as a revenue generator or a subtle social commentary on commerce and sanitation. But either way, it sparks a sleepy fascination. You can almost hear merchants grumbling quietly while collecting the golden liquid, eyes darting nervously toward the watchful tax collector. The mental image is both absurd and oddly soothing, like a bedtime story laced with humor and historical curiosity. And there are taxes tied to personal appearance or behavior. In some medieval towns, citizens were fined for wearing excessively extravagant clothing. Even during festivals, you wander past a young woman with a gown rimmed in silver thread, feeling the weight of her fear as she adjusts her attire to avoid penalties. Scholars still debate whether these taxes were designed to maintain social hierarchy, curb envy, or simply fund the local treasury. But imagining someone nervously measuring their hemline in candlelight gives a sleepy, mischievous charm to history. You might be surprised to learn that playing cards or dice could also carry taxes. Picture a quiet evening in a tavern, dice rolling across tables, coins exchanging hands, but now, imagine a shadowy collector making sure each game is properly taxed. Oddly enough, these taxes were sometimes calculated per throw, per game, or per participant. Scholars still argue whether this was a form of revenue generation or a control mechanism against gambling excesses. But the sleepy, precise absurdity of such rules is hypnotic. You can almost feel the tension of balancing entertainment with legality, a universal human experience centuries ago. Food taxes were equally peculiar. In certain European cities, cheese, bread, and even ale were taxed differently depending on weight, quality, or day of the week. You wander past a bustling marketplace where vendors carefully weigh their goods, ensuring they comply with the latest decree. Oddly enough, some clever merchants found loopholes, mixing small amounts of taxed and untaxed goods to skirt penalties. Scholars still argue whether these convoluted rules were fair or exploitative, but either interpretation adds a humorous, sleepy layer to your mental stroll. Animal taxes are another treasure trove of absurdity. Imagine paying a fee simply for owning pigs, ducks, or even cats because authorities deemed them a public concern or a source of revenue. You wander past a sleepy barnyard, feeling the surreal weight of bureaucracy as farmers count their animals anxiously, coins jingling in nervous hands. Scholars still debate whether these taxes were primarily fiscal or social, but the very notion of paying for the mere existence of your pet evokes a gentle, whimsical curiosity. Oddly enough, some taxes were location-specific. Certain bridges, gates, or even streets required tolls for passage, sometimes enforceable even at night. You wander along a quiet cobblestone bridge, moonlight reflecting off stone, imagining the toll collector dozing lightly while travelers tiptoe past. The absurd specificity of these fees, combined with sleepy nocturnal imagery, evokes a gentle, as Mr.-like curiosity. Scholars still argue whether these levies were genuinely about infrastructure maintenance or subtle social control. But either way, they shape your dreamlike understanding of historical life. One of the quirkiest forms of taxation involved activities considered frivolous or non-essential, such as dancing, playing music, or even laughing in public. You imagine a town square where a musician hesitates before strumming, worried that the wrong chord might invite a fine. Scholars still debate whether these taxes were moralistic or purely fiscal. But either way, the tension combined with the absurdity is strangely soothing. You wander past silent courtyards where citizens move cautiously, aware of invisible fiscal eyes, feeling the sleepy rhythm of life under strange rules. Another peculiar layer emerges with taxes on words or speech. In some regions, speaking loudly, gossiping excessively, or insulting officials could be indirectly taxed through fines. You wander past a sleeping market where whispers replace full chatter, the air thick with both caution and intrigue. Scholars still argue whether these rules were genuinely enforceable or mostly symbolic. But the sheer audacity of regulating speech makes you grin softly. further lulling your mind into the dreamy cadence of history. Even the act of breathing in certain spaces wasn't always free. In some towns, public fountains or wells had regulated access, requiring fees for water collection. You wander through an early morning mist, imagining citizens dipping jars cautiously, calculating coins and murmuring prayers. Scholars still argue whether such regulations were about fairness, revenue, or public health, but either way, the mental imagery is hypnotic, a rhythm of human life constrained by absurd, sleepy rules. And finally, as section for closes, you feel the gentle pull of curiosity and drowsiness entwined. The sheer breadth of these strange taxes, from urine to music, from food to animals, from speech to clothing, creates a mental landscape that's both ridiculous and mesmerizing. You wander back through marketplace scenes, barns, bridges, and taverns, feeling the peculiar rhythm of medieval and ancient life. These absurd levies, though long forgotten, echo with the humor and meticulousness of past societies, preparing your mind to drift seamlessly into the next section's strange family rules enforced by law. You wander through the sleepy courtyards of a medieval town, lanterns casting soft golden glows on timbered houses, and your mind drifts toward a category of laws that strangely intimate rules controlling family life. You probably won't survive if you tried obeying these regulations exactly as they were written, but imagining them is oddly comforting, like stepping into someone else's late-night daydream. Families weren't just social units, they were regulated structures, with laws dictating marriages, inheritance, child-rearing, and even domestic behavior. Consider marriage laws, for instance. In certain European kingdoms, parents were legally required to approve or arrange their children's marriages, and violating this could lead to fines or social sanctions. You wander past a sleepy household where a young couple exchanges secret glances, whispering under candlelight, knowing that defying a parent could result in legal trouble. Scholars still argue whether such laws were primarily about preserving wealth, consolidating power, or maintaining social stability. But the tension they created within families is palpable. The image of cautious, careful lovers, tiptoeing around both law and parental authority, carries a subtle charm, a sleepy tension that draws you deeper into historical imagination. Inheritance laws were just as peculiar. You imagine a father seated in a dimly lit study, quill scratching across parchment, dividing up property according to strict legal codes. In some regions, eldest sons received the bulk of estates, and daughters could inherit only under highly specific conditions. Oddly enough, this sometimes forced families into elaborate financial gymnastics, arranging marriages, dividing livestock, or even moving residences to comply with law. Scholars still debate whether primogeniture was meant for stability or simply to ensure state continuity. But imagining these familial negotiations is both educational and soothing, like a sleepy puzzle unfolding over generations. Oddly enough, some laws govern child behavior. In certain towns, children could be punished for not attending lessons or for wandering too far from home. You wander through a quiet village street, seeing children pause mid-step, aware that straying too far could invite reprimand from both family and magistrate. Scholars still argue whether these rules were primarily protective or authoritarian. But the sleepy rhythm of regulated childhood life carries a soft, almost as Mr.-like quality, the kind that lulls the imagination gently. Domestic disputes, too, were regulated. Certain laws dictated how families resolved disagreements, especially over property or marriage arrangements. You wander into a cozy cottage, hearing hushed arguments over dowries, inheritance, or household duties. Scholars still argue whether these laws empowered ordinary citizens or reinforced patriarchal control. But either interpretation provides a fascinating glimpse into how private life and public law intertwined. It's a blend of human drama and gentle absurdity, perfect for a sleepy historical journey. Even food and domestic chores could fall under legal scrutiny. In some regions, households were legally required to maintain certain cleanliness standards or prepare food in regulated ways. You imagine a mother kneading dough carefully, mindful that her bread might be inspected for weight or quality, while children fetch water from the village well under watchful eyes. Scholars still argue whether these rules were public health measures or social control tactics. But either way, the image is oddly comforting as structured. Rhythmic domestic life preserved by law. You might be surprised to learn that family ceremonies had legal mandates. Births, baptisms, weddings, and funerals often required formal registration, witnessed by local officials. Imagine wandering through a sleepy churchyard where candles flicker over parchment ledgers, capturing the smallest details of family milestones. Scholars still debate whether this bureaucratic attention was about control, taxation, or social order, but either way, it lends a cozy, meticulous texture to the sleepy imagination. And finally, as last section closes, you feel a sleepy sense of rhythm. A world where the most intimate aspects of life, hair, posture, clothing, accessories were monitored, sometimes absurdly by law. You wander past lantern-lit streets, citizens moving with measured steps, and notice how even regulation and constraint carry a quiet, hypnotic charm. These laws controlling body and appearance, while peculiar, draw your imagination gently toward the next section: food and drink prohibitions that shock citizens. And if you've been drifting somewhere between curiosity and dreams, maybe that's a sign it's time to hit that subscribe button. If you enjoy wandering through strange corners of history like this, leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. Tell me in the comments which weird law surprised you the most tonight.